My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is former State Representative Aaron Regunberg, who is a candidate for the Democratic nomination to replace David Cicilline in the 1st Congressional District. Welcome back to State of the State.
Thanks so much, Richard. It's great to be here.
Mr. Regunberg was a member of the Rhode Island Legislature from 2015 to 2019 before running for Lieutenant Governor in 2018. He is known as a progressive activist who has been endorsed by Senator Bernie Sanders and members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus such as Jamie Raskin, Ro Khanna, and Jan Schakowsky. Help our audience understand, how do you define progressivism in your view?
So for me, progressive means that you're fighting to make government work for everyone, not just big corporations, not just the folks who can hire the big lobbyists to run the halls. I think it might mean different things to different people, but to me, ultimately, it's about we're working to build an economy that works for everyone and a government that's actually solving regular people's problems.
There are, I guess, a dozen Democrats running for this seat in Congress right now, and the front runner was believed to be the current Lieutenant Governor, Sabinal Matos, who seems to be running on her credentials as an immigrant from the Dominican Republic. Now, a paid campaign worker forged signatures on her qualification papers, including people who have deceased. And initially, Lieutenant Governor Matos said this person didn't represent her campaign. And actually, the Board of Elections has been kind of backing and filling on this whole issue as to about her qualification. Mr. Regunberg, what is your position on this issue? Should Sabinal Matos be disqualified from running?
Well, I mean, the ballots have been printed. I think it's, to some degree at this point, it's a moot point. I mean, I think it's good that the Board of Elections is meeting again tomorrow to try to get to the bottom of just how many signatures are we talking about here, because there were the several municipalities where Board of Canvassers found them, but it looks like there were a lot of places where maybe they weren't checking as carefully. Yeah. I've known the Lieutenant Governor for many years. I don't think she would ever have purposefully, been directing something like this. But I do think, for all of us, the buck stops with the candidate for what a campaign's responsible for, and for me, the real concern here is, we're living in a moment when faith in our elections can't be taken for granted, right? The Republican Party has been actively trying to undermine faith in our elections in ways that could be really damaging to our democracy. And as Democrats, I think it's really important that we are working to build and support an electoral system that works and a sense of confidence in that system. And so I think, to me, that's the real shame about this whole situation.
I hate to bring this up, but last week you're well aware that the Providence Journal ran what I would describe as a hit piece about you and your campaign. You know what I'm talking about. And they refer to you as a privileged rich kid supported by super PACs and so forth. They point out that apparently your father-in-law has made a significant contribution to a super PAC, as your mother made a similar contribution. You have said that you do not want to accept money from corporate PACs, but you're obviously accepting it from another super PAC. How do you respond to this article? I'll give you a chance to tell the public what this means.
Yeah, well, it's not accepting money. You can't coordinate with these outside spending. I think anyone who looks at my record knows I've spent years trying to get money out of politics. And in Congress, I would be fighting to overturn Citizens United and ban super PACs across the board. This is not an effort that we were expecting. There are numerous vehicles engaged in outside spending for a number of the candidates in this race.
Including Lieutenant Governor Matos, by the way, who's getting money from a Hispanic group.
Right. There's, I think, about $500,000 in the next couple of weeks that's going to get spent on her behalf. I've said, I would gladly join with the other candidates in this race whose campaigns are have super PAC spending on their behalf to say we want to call for an end to all outside spending in this race.
Well, I think one of the problems with Citizens United, and I've certainly had a number of candidates express your viewpoint on it, but on the other hand, you cannot, a person who's independently wealthy, for example, who wants to run for office, let's take, for example, a gentleman named Trump, who was president. If you want to spend your own personal money on your campaign, wouldn't that be a violation of the First Amendment if you said, no, you can't spend your own money on your campaign?
Well, so Citizens United, that court decision did not actually open the door to self-funding. It was an earlier decision, Buckley v. FEC, I think, that started that process. And Citizens United opened the door to uncapped outside spending that doesn't coordinate with campaigns. Again, I think for those of us who, I've pushed for public financing of elections, I think we should be getting money out of politics completely. I think that's a really important issue. Again, my father-in-law is someone who has some money and they did this and we weren't expecting it. But in response to that Projo article, I mean, I know who I am, right? There have been a lot of attacks on my character and background over the years, and I know that I'm the grandson of a refugee from the Holocaust who came to this country in 1948 with one suitcase. My mom raised my sister and me on her own as a single working mom after my father passed away before I was born. So those are the experiences and values that have informed my work as an organizer working with young people fighting for changes in our public schools, as a legislator in the General Assembly leading fights to pass paid sick days for over 100,000 Rhode Islanders who before couldn't care for a loved one or recover from an illness without having to worry about losing their pay, leading the fight to increase the minimum wage for tipped workers in our state for the first time in 20 years, and create new clean energy programs and expand overdose prevention strategies for folks struggling with substance use disorder, and begin the fight to reform solitary confinement in our prisons, and work as a lawyer to support the court cases trying to hold Chevron and Exxon and Shell accountable for their environmental crimes. So that's the work that I've been doing here in Rhode Island for many years, and that's the kind of record that we're running on in this race.
So after your run for lieutenant governor, you did graduate actually from Harvard Law, correct?
That's right.
You passed the bar, and are you practicing law right now?
Yes, so I spent the last year as a judicial clerk for the U.S. District Court for the District of Rhode Island, which really gives you a sense of, the ways courts work and the real impact that these judicial decisions have on people's everyday lives. And definitely gave me a window into the needs that we have for court reform in this country. Senator Whitehouse has been leading the charge on this push, but I really think that we've got a Supreme Court that has gone off the rails in its wielding of unconstrained, undemocratically accountable power. And I think it's really important that some of those solutions that folks like Senator Whitehouse have been pushing for, an ethics code for the Supreme Court so that they're bound by the same kind of constraints as the district court judge that I clerked for. Regulation requirement that we have term limits for Supreme Court judges, so that folks aren't gaming the appointment system in the way they are now. A requirement that the Supreme Court have a supermajority to overturn little d democratically passed legislation. I think there's a lot we need to do to deal with some of the issues we've been seeing in our judicial system.
You said your website says you supported court cases to hold big oil companies accountable for their environmental crimes, close quote. In fact, you go on to say you want to fight big pharma, big banks, and big oil who are ripping us off. How are these companies ripping us off? Let's start with that phrase. How are they ripping us off? In what sense?
Well, you talk about big pharma, and I can't tell you how many folks I've talked to over the course of this campaign and before who, we've got seniors who are being forced to choose between filling their prescription and buying groceries, because again and again we have prescription new drugs that are often developed in large part through our taxpayer public dollars, and then we give an exclusive license to a pharmaceutical company, and then they jack up the prices by like 6,000%, whatever it might be, and they're making billions and billions of dollars. And I think that happening at the same time as seniors are cutting pills in half to try to get by, to me seems incredibly unfair. There are policies we can pass to stop that kind of price gouging, to require drug companies to negotiate, to explore. In California, they've started a pilot program where the state of California is going to be producing insulin publicly at cost. That's the kind of thing that I think we should be exploring. You mentioned the fossil fuel industry, and the fossil fuel industry, Exxon, BP, Chevron, et cetera, they have known exactly the effects, the greenhouse effects of their products for 60 years, right? In the 60s, there were Exxon scientists saying, literally making predictions exactly what is happening now. And you know what they did with that information? They didn't use it to say, okay, we need to start a transition to clean energy so that we can maintain a habitable planet. They, one, used that information to raise the level of their offshore oil rigs because they knew that the sea was going to rise, and so they took that action. And two, they created this million dollar campaign of deception and fraud to try to block or slow climate action, to try to persuade Americans that climate crisis isn't real when we're seeing it around us every day. And so that, there is a number of court cases, as you mentioned, by cities, states, counties that are trying to hold those companies accountable for that fraud. And I think that is a really important area of work.
As a lawyer, you know that fraud is a very interesting concept in the law. And you're using the term fraud in what sense?
I mean, so these companies, despite knowing that climate change is real, that it's caused by the burning of their products, they spent millions and millions of dollars deceiving Americans, selling their products in ways that there's a number of different legal theories of liability, but ultimately, I mean, it comes down to there was deception and fraud, and they made a lot of money off of it, and we are experiencing the consequences of that. Cities, counties, states are currently spending untold amounts of money to prepare, to adapt, to deal with the increased extreme weather events that we're experiencing. And that's money that the folks who created this crisis should be supporting our communities in dealing with those problems.
Many of the people that I've talked to that are, again, believe in, I guess you believe, man-made climate change is occurring. I've asked this question, and maybe you can answer it. Scientists generally believe there have been at least 5 ice ages. The last one occurred 34 million years ago, and where we are sitting today would probably be under 40 feet of ice. So what caused the glaciers to advance and recede when there were no human beings on Earth? I mean, is climate change inevitable? Are we just looking at what's been happening over the last 100 years, which is merely a blink of an eye in terms of cosmic time?
Well, that's exactly the problem. I mean, the climate has big tectonic shifts over time. The rate of change that we've been experiencing over the last 100 years is so exponentially more than, at such a greater speed than anything that has ever happened naturally. And that's how we know that it is happening, because we're burning fossil fuels, which is adding to the greenhouse effect, meaning that more heat is being kept in the planet. And think about this summer, right? It's pretty nice out this week, but it's been a tough summer for a lot of folks. It's either been overwhelmingly hot and humid, or we've had these crazy squalls. I mean, I remember 4th of July, my wife and son and I were trying to get to a friend's house for a barbecue, and that horrible rainstorm hit, and we literally had to turn around because the roads all around their house were completely submerged. We couldn't get there. And so I think, this is impacting our lives in ways big and small. I was talking to someone the other day from Burrowville who was talking about how growing up they always used to, the ponds would freeze over and they'd play ice hockey on the ponds every winter. And he was talking about how his kids haven't been able to do that because the ponds aren't freezing over like they used to. I think we're losing a lot of what makes our lives beautiful. Summer is becoming less of, this fun, lovely time and more of a dangerous time. We had, in June, there was a week where the sky was gray from smoke from those historic wildfires
in Canada.
In Canada.
Caused by what?
Caused by a degree of drought that they haven't had, and heat that they haven't had. In
Canada?
Yeah.
Okay. This is where we could part ways a bit, because there is no drought in Canada, and the reason they're having the wildfires uncontrollable is because they haven't managed the forest very well. And that's what's happened in California was the same thing. They do not allow people to do controlled burns and so forth. But I mean, that's the other side of the argument. And if people have to decide. I've been on the planet a little bit longer than you, maybe 3 or 4 times longer. And I can remember working on a farm in Connecticut in much hotter temperatures during the summer. And I can remember very cold winters. So I don't know exactly what effect the fossil fuel industry has had on this, but
To be clear,
yeah, go ahead.
There is an overwhelming consensus among scientists that the climate crisis is severe, it's dangerous, and it's caused by human activity. I don't trust my own analysis or opinion that much, but I trust, what 99.9% of the folks who study this in real sustained ways say. And I do trust what I see with my own eyes every day. I mean, we are seeing more extreme heat days over the course of summers over the last few years than we have even a few years ago. I've been in Rhode Island for 15 years, and I've seen a difference. I think a lot of people have.
One of the other targets in your website, you talk about the gun industry, that you want to fight the gun industry. Do you believe in the Second Amendment?
I mean, we have a Second Amendment. That's clear.
Do you believe in the Second Amendment? Yes, we agree we have one, but you are a graduate of the top law school in the country. I mean, people in New Haven might argue that, but seriously, do you believe in the Second Amendment?
I mean, I believe in all the amendments, and what you learn in law school is that every amendment has some level of restriction, right? There's no amendment that, again, we have freedom of speech. That is probably the most extreme foundational principle of American democracy.
Probably because that's why it's first, I guess.
It's critical, right? Yeah. But it's not. But there are restrictions to freedom of speech. You can't yell fire in a theater, right? There are cases that we've determined where we say there has to be some limit here, and I think there's very reasonable limits to prevent gun tragedies and violence that we should let elected officials pursue. Because again, I mean, I've got a 2-year-old. I worry all the time, is he going to be safe at school from guns and mass shootings? And I think it is government's place to try to keep us safe.
So specifically, when you say you want to fight the gun industry, what do you want to fight? What do you want to do to the industry? I don't quite understand. That's a general term. You want to fight the gun industry.
I mean, what I want to be pushing for common sense gun violence prevention measures. When I was in the legislature every year, I introduced legislation to ban high-capacity magazines. That was finally passed into law.
Which is being challenged, by the way, in appeal.
Correct.
Yeah.
The U.S. District Court for the District of Rhode Island upheld that law. I was clerk in there, actually. There's legislation that was pushed this year in the legislature, which I don't understand why it didn't pass, for safe and secure storage, saying that we should be having some requirements or responsibilities, so a kid can't find a gun and blow someone away. There's legislation around red flag laws. There's legislation talking about being a lawyer. The gun industry is the only industry I know of that has been given this liability loophole where it can't be held accountable for the effects of its products, unlike any other industry, so that folks who are devastated by these kind of tragedies don't have any recompense. And so I think there's a lot of different measures. I think there's a lot of issues that the majority of Americans agree on, that you can support the Second Amendment and support universal background checks. You can support the Second Amendment and say, well, we don't need extreme military style weapons on our streets. So I think there's a lot of common ground that we can build, but there's an industry that's making a lot of money off of the kinds of tragedies that we're seeing every day in the news or experiencing in our communities. And it is going to take some real leadership and courage to be able to take on those entrenched interests and fight for some real change.
So I understand your position and what has been said about the industry having a certain amount of protection. The question that's raised, and maybe you have an answer to it, is if a drunk driver is driving a certain type of car, it doesn't have to be drunk. There was a situation, a mass terrorist attack where a guy drove his SUV into a crowd of people, pedestrians, or marchers actually, if you recall, a couple of years ago. No one is arguing that you should sue the manufacturer of the SUV he's driving, but the argument you're advancing is that the manufacturer of a gun should be held responsible for the actions of say a deranged person and who uses that gun to cause harm. So what's where's the difference?
Well, I actually think the car analogy is a really apt one, because you think about the legal frameworks we have around cars safety, around requiring tests and licenses for people in order to be able to drive, that they have to regularly renew. You have to have training. We have speed limits on the street, right? We have police who pull you aside if you are driving dangerously. And I think when you look at regulation of guns, it doesn't feel like there is that degree of levels of safeguards. And I think that's what people are pushing for. It's just saying, let's treat this like the potentially really dangerous item that it is, and let's have some common sense regulations around them. It's not about taking away the Second Amendment. It's about what can we do to protect our kids, to protect our communities.
You said that, and I've heard this argument as well, that no rights are not absolute, especially the Bill of Rights. I guess my question is, how about the right of women to vote, or the right of people to not be enslaved? Those are in the amendment to the Constitution. Are those absolute, or are they subject to change?
I mean, they're not absolute, right? There are people can't vote for certain reasons.
A woman can't vote. Now, there's an amendment to the Constitution that gave women the right to vote.
But I think that folks who are involved in the criminal legal system should be able to vote, but in most places you can't vote.
Yeah, but what about women? I'm talking specifically about the amendment that gave women universal suffrage, gave them the right to vote. Is that not absolute, or is that subject to change?
I'm saying in a lot of places, a woman who is in prison or even formerly incarcerated can't vote.
Well, so that's true of a man too. That's not just a woman, right?
Right.
Okay, so how about the right of the amendment that outlawed slavery? Is that absolute?
I mean, again, and we can argue whether this is right, but again, people who are in prison have to work without being compensated.
People who are in prison are not enslaved. They're there for a reason, because society places them there, because they're a threat to the community or have done something to demand some sort of restitution.
Right, there's reason, right?
Right.
There's reason, and right. I think that's what people would say. There's reason to have some common sense restrictions on this right. Again,
okay.
the right in the Constitution, it doesn't actually talk about an individual's right to a firearm. It talks about the right to a well-regulated, the need to have a well-regulated militia.
The Heller decision said that this is an individual right. Now, you're a graduate of one of the best law schools in the country. You know that the Heller decision said that this.
But again, that's a Supreme Court decision. That's an interpretation of the Constitution.
Which is what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, isn't it?
Right. But lots of people disagree about the interpretation of the Constitution, right?
Okay, let's get to a real basic question. As a progressive, do you believe that the Constitution is still an applicable document given the current political environment and the desires of the people? Should we convene a constitutional convention to, if you were in Congress and someone said we have to have a constitutional convention to really re-examine that whole document, would you support that?
I mean, I love our Constitution. I think it's, and one of the things about it is that it is in an ideal world, a self-correcting document, right? It has within it mechanisms for amendments. And so I think we have that structure. It's really hard to do, so we might want to think about are there ways within our political gridlock to ease the political gridlock that blocks those conversations. But again, I mean, we've got the whole field of constitutional law is trying to interpret what the Constitution means.
Mm-hmm. We're, believe it or not, nearly out of time. I wish we had you on for an hour because
it's a great conversation.
Yeah, well, I enjoy it. I always enjoy talking to you, Aaron. We have another comment I'd like to talk about is the Democratic Party has often been referred to as the party of the working man. And yet I look at the people who are the big supporters of the party, people like Mark Zuckerberg, Bill and Melinda Gates, Jeff Bezos, Michael Bloomberg, George Soros and his son Alexander. Do you think that the party is truly representative of the working man as it once was portrayed, certainly when I was growing up?
That's a great question. I mean, I think when it comes to fighting for working people, I don't think there's any question between the Republican Party, which has way more billionaires on its side, and the Democratic Party. To me, there's a very clear choice. Having said that, there's a lot of ways in which I think the Democratic Party needs to do a much better job of standing up for working people. I think that's, for me being a progressive, you asked what does that mean? It means pushing the Democratic Party to be the best version of itself that it can be. Standing up to ban stock trading, right, for members of Congress, because we should be putting the public interest over people's self-interest. Standing up for building a stronger labor movement, because when working people can come together, that is how we get the kind of wages that folks deserve.
I want to cut you off because we're almost out of time, and I want to give you a minute or so to explain to people why they should support Aaron Regunberg for Congress. Now that we're actually we're almost in the voting season for this.
Yeah, it's wild how fast it's gone.
Go ahead.
Well, I appreciate every voter's consideration. I think that this is a really important race. This is the kind of district that can support someone who is going to be more than just a Democratic vote, but someone like David Cicilline who can organize and bring people together and has a record of winning real positive policy change. And that's the work I've been doing here in Rhode Island for many years as an organizer, as a state legislator, passing paid sick days and raising wages and creating new clean energy programs. And I think that's the kind of work we need to be doing in Washington right now. And so grateful for viewers' consideration. And as you said, voting's coming up soon. Yeah,
and I want to tell our audience that, first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Regunberg, for coming on once again. And I want to remind our audience that voter turnout for primaries is typically very low. With a number of candidates seeking the Democratic Party's nomination, this is going to be decided by only a few votes. So to make our democratic republic work, people have to come out and vote. We want to encourage you to do that. And thank you once again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
State of the State.